Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.
Hello everybody and welcome to Future Hacker. I'm your host, Maria Taide, and today I'm especially excited about our guest. We're talking to Rawi Adbelal, Professor of International Management at Harvard Business School, the faculty co-chair of the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative, and the director of Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. His primary expertise is international political economy, and his research focuses on the politics of globalization on the political economy of Eurasia. Rawi's first book, National Purpose in the World Economy, won the 2002 Shulman Prize as the outstanding book on the international relations of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. He is the author or co-edited several other books, like The Rules of Globalization, Measuring Identity and Constructing the International Economy. He also collects a list of 10 awards, and mostly important, he was my professor at Harvard Business School for the General Management program. And I must say, his classes are breathtaking. I honestly needed a couple of hours just to think about life, which was impossible due to Harvard's crazy schedule. Hi, Hari. How are you doing? It's so amazing to have you with us today.
Oh, I'm so delighted, Maria. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be back with my friend and student.
I'm really, really excited about this podcast, and, I've been willing to interview you for quite some time. And after I heard your podcast with Carrie Siggins, that you state that there's no such thing as a future, and something about people predicting the future are lunatics.
Yes.
I kind of had to invite you here right away, right? So let's explore this idea a little more. Don't you think that for us to try to follow certain directions to at least pretend we're building the future, shouldn't we be aiming at certain scenarios as much as we understand that there are things that we couldn't simply predict?
Maria, I'm glad you brought that up because I was thinking about that observation in the context of the name of your podcast. And so in some sense, there is a thing that will be the future. My feeling is that the futures are always multiple. There are different possible scenarios. And one reason I like to think of it that way is that we have agency over which future we get. So I really make that point in the sense that I want us all to take responsibility for the future and to make sure that we don't assume that it's predestined for us, that it is fated for us, that we can change elements of what we will get. And so in that sense, like at some point the present will end, and the present is always ending, and the present is ending right now. But I don't want to mostly imagine what all of us will do before we get to the future that we deliver to ourselves.
I do like your perspective, right? And also love this idea of we have to take ownership of the future. I think that when we have that more clear in our minds, I think we're more prone to trying to make changes now, thinking about whatever is going to happen afterwards. And I think that people are usually prone to making others responsible to whatever is happening around them.
Yeah, totally. Did you ever watch the Star Wars movies?
Yes, of course.
Right? So like a wise character in the Star Wars movies once said, always in motion is the future. So that was Yoda from, way back in the day. So just the sense that like the future is fluid. We take responsibility for it. It's not just something we have to wait and see what's going to happen. Totally.
Awesome. And, talking about uncertainty, right? Which is talking about the future is talking about uncertainties, right? Somehow. Of course, I had to ask my HBS colleagues if they had any questions for you before even I came up with the questions that I had. And, the most recurring subject is naturally the pandemic, right? It's like unavoidable. I'd like to cover a couple of topics that came up. So the first is, as you've been talking about in the podcast that I heard, inequality has been widely exposed with the lockdown, right? As working and studying from home is clearly a privilege for the few. What industries and even countries do you think would have long-lasting changes in working from home versus from office setup? And to what degree? And I would add to this question, do you still see inequality increasing in the coming years as a consequence of what is going on right now?
Those are great questions, Maria. The data are very difficult to collect on how many jobs can be done remotely, like how much of the work that gets done is work that can be done from home or from anywhere, just remotely. But one collection of data that I trust suggests that no more than about 45% of jobs in any country can be done remotely. So that's like the maximum. That's where the United States is. That's where the United Kingdom is. And the lower the GDP per capita, so the lower the income per capita of a country, the smaller the percentage of jobs that can be done remotely. And so there are countries that are very poor countries in which 5 or 6% of jobs can be done remotely. And then if we layer that onto another fact, which is, as you said, the ability to work remotely is highly correlated with the income level within the countries, which is to say, the higher paid the job, the more likely it can be done remotely. And so one of the challenges that we faced during the pandemic, and this is the sort of privilege element that you describe, is that most jobs can't be done remotely, and those that can be done remotely tend to be higher paying jobs within every economy in which they're situated. And so that meant that eras of lockdown really had profound distributional consequences. So there are, in lots of countries, many, many people who, when we told them they couldn't leave their home, it meant that they were going to go hungry. It meant that they weren't going to earn money, which is not to say it was a bad idea necessarily from a public health perspective. But what I find deeply problematic is the requirement that people stay home without additional support and acknowledgement of the fact that we're putting this huge economic burden on themselves and their families. And so really, I just don't feel like you can do one without the other.
And it's a snowball, right?
Absolutely, it's a snowball. So then when we think about the future of work, and I'm not an expert in the future of work, and I'm sure you've talked to experts in the future of work, but I think that we will see industries in which hybrid work makes lots of sense, but also industries in which purely remote work is impossible, especially work that is creative, that involves group collaboration and in-person spontaneous thinking as a group. And so I think the number of jobs that will be fully remote is much smaller than lots of people expect, in part because those are jobs that are really mostly, I think, individual contributor kind of jobs, where it's just not required. And then leave aside all of the other interesting challenges about our personality types and which of us feel great just being at home and not interacting in groups. And I'm an introvert. I don't know your personality type. I could guess.
I'm loving being at home. But, I think it's a mix of the personality types and the infrastructure that we're able to have as well, right?
Absolutely.
I don't miss the meetings, the presence of people at all,
No, totally. Like in my house, we have 3 introverts and 1 more extroverted person. But one of the things that we realized is that actually, if you have a household full of introverts, some of them have to leave in order for you to have this space. And so that's actually one of the other interesting challenges. It's not just not being around other people. It's just about like having time to decompress and take care of oneself in one's own space, which is, for me, an unexpected outcome of the whole personality type matching up with remote work issues. And so like right now I'm in my HBS office, which I'm happy to have access to it. But it's my space, right? This is my space right now. And that feels good as well. But on the other question you raised about lingering element of income inequality or gender inequality or racial inequality or educational inequality, I think we will be living with the consequences of the fact that the pandemic magnified every inequality that we had. When I think about the fact that so many working mothers have left the workforce across many, many, many countries because of the challenges of managing remote education and the burnout that was a result of all of this. That will take a generation to undo, I think, actually. We think about the people who lost their jobs and who did not lose their jobs, and the long-term unemployment that results from having fallen out of the workforce during this moment. If we look at economic recovery within nations that have begun to recover, it's so uneven, which is to say high skill labor is back to the same employment levels that existed before the pandemic. High wage labor, same. Medium skill, medium wage is about 5 or 10% off in most countries. And then low skill, low wage labor, employment levels are about 20% below what they were before the pandemic. So that's going to take a long time to deal with. So that's on gender and labor and income. But let's just talk for a moment about education. I have a couple of kids, as I think you know, and I've seen pictures of you with one of yours. You have one?
I have, yes, a 2-year-old baby.
Yes. So maybe remote education has not been such a challenge for you.
Actually, yes, they try to make my 2-year-old watch classes, which is
impossible.
It's absolutely crazy, right? So, you know.
But the data from the United States are really, really striking. And I think there are even bigger disparities outside the United States, although we don't have the data, which is to say the quality of remote education that was delivered was highly correlated with both race and income. And so kids in higher income households had access to much better remote education, especially when they had access to excellent private schools, for example. And kids at lower income levels, or Black children or Latin children in the United States, again correlated with income, had access to either low quality remote education or, in so many cases, no education at all. A McKinsey study done last spring at the end of that first crazy effort to try to educate children remotely revealed that about 40% of low-income children in the United States and about 40% of Black children in the United States had basically not been going to school at all. So not just low-quality remote education, they'd just not been showing up, nothing had been provided for them. And then you think about the number of those children who probably didn't get back into another year of remote education. We're just coming to the end of a school year in the United States. We're talking about tens of thousands of children in the United States who've basically not been receiving an education for a year and a half. And that's in the United States. So imagine most developing countries. And I think that's going to take a generation to fix, right? It's not going to be easy for all of these children to catch up. And so I see some wrenching difficulties resolving the inequalities that were magnified during the pandemic and by the policies associated with the pandemic. And some of them, especially the education one, those are just heartbreaking to me.
And not even to mention, if you add to the lack of, quality education, whichever crazy household environment the children had to live in as well, right? And I'm pretty sure that most of, at least the developing countries, won't be able to offer any mental health support for a whole generation, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's actually one of the topics that I want to try to cover is the future of mental health, which is something that it's been always important, but I think that now, with all this craziness that we're living, for sure there is a whole generation that is going to need more support probably than others, right?
Totally. Oh, I definitely think you should pursue that topic. And I think it would be great to pursue that topic just to normalize the fact that almost none of us came out of this okay. I'm definitely not okay. And most of the people I know are not okay. And I've been in therapy on and off for 25 years. And I would love for you to do an episode and say you know what? It's okay. We all are going to need some extra help here. All of us. And so if you're not in therapy now, you should, if you can, you should try to get in therapy because we're going to need to work through a lot of things.
Exactly. That's exactly my goal, and I know I consider myself totally on the fortunate side of, having the infrastructure, having the family support, and being able to get therapy as well, but we need to talk about that. That's for sure. So let's see if I succeed on that. So, another question that came up is regarding the vaccine, right? It's being distributed in very different ways around the world, where some countries like the US, China, Israel are being, covered pretty well when you compare to Brazil, Italy, India, that is super struggling right now to catch up. It seems it's not really a matter of medical resources, but more of a political interest going on. So what's behind all of that? And there's a question that I love, that is there a silent war going on between governments and big conglomerates?
So I definitely think we're living through a moment of both vaccine nationalism and vaccine geopolitics. So the vaccine nationalism, I suppose what I mean by that, and I didn't invent that phrase, but what it means to me is countries that have within them companies where the research has been done, where the taxes are paid, where the headquarters are, clearly have been able to get greater access to doses of vaccine. And I suppose that shouldn't surprise us. We're living through an era of nationalism and populism otherwise. And so the fact that countries can do it, of course, they will. But what that means is that, the last person to be vaccinated on the planet is probably I don't know. And I'm not an expert in this, but 3 years away, 4 years away. Like by the time it makes its way to the last person in the developing country with very limited resources, it's not this summer, right? It's not this autumn. And, I'm a beneficiary of that vaccine nationalism. So basically everybody in my household will be vaccinated within the next month. Very different story, as you say, in lots of other countries. And think about the implications of that for economic recovery. So we will have an uneven global economic recovery, in part because of the uneven and slow distribution of vaccines around the world. And, the situation in India is, as we all see, like desperately, desperately tragic. The vaccine geopolitics that you mentioned, and that's my phrase, not exactly yours, but I think it's a fine one. I think there's less kind of conspiracy behind it and less intentionality behind it. There's a little bit of that, where China has been trying to earn the favor of some countries by sharing vaccine. The United States has been trying to do the same. Russia has been trying to do the same. But this is a kind of geopolitics I can get behind, actually. Like if the superpowers are going to share vaccine doses with countries around the world in order to compete for influence, in a moment when we really need vaccine doses to be spread around the world, okay, that's not the worst kind of power politics I can imagine. They're much, much worse.
It's part of the game, right?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Rawi. We're getting to the end of the first episode with you, but there's so much to cover. So stay tuned, everybody. We're moving to a second episode with Rawi.
Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.